The skiff nosed through the green-black water of the inner harbor with the stubborn determination of a stray dog, its oarsmen hunched and silent under a crust of old salt. The fog lay low on Bravos this morning, as if the city had decided to hide half of itself to save on taxes. Bells tolled somewhere, faint, cautious, while the Titan's distant roar rolled over the sea like the memory of war. Jon Snow sat with his arms folded beneath the damp cloak Sansa had pressed on him before he left the north, a garment that carried the snow smell of ghost pine and the memory of a sister's steady eyes. "Dock there?" the oarsman rasped, not waiting for permission. The skiff scuffed alongside a weed-slick pier lined by lamp-lit lion heads. No two lion mouths were the same. One grinned, one sneered, one looked half asleep. Jon knew something about being half asleep. Night's Watch vows had taught him one kind of wakefulness, and the war another, but the sleep that followed had not belonged to him. He was a man who had died and been pulled back, and the world did not forget to look sideways at such a man. A figure waited at the top of the steps, the gray beard cut square, the cloak of sea blue velvet edged with black fox. Tycho Nestoris had once put gold behind Stannis' stubbornness and later loosened coin like a surgeon loosens cloth from a wound. He was thinner now. Care will do that. "Lord Snow," Tycho said, voice low. "Come. The mornings make liars of lungs." He offered an arm more courtly than necessary and led Jon up into the throat of the Iron Bank, a place that traditionally greeted visitors with a silence so absolute it felt as if one had walked into a canvas painting. They moved through galleries of marble veining like frost on glass. Men and women who fancied themselves as statues watched them pass. In Bravos, even the furniture could be bought. In a small room alive with the glow of beeswax tapers, Tycho dismissed the attendants and poured warm wine without asking. He set a folded parchment beside the cup, a map of Essos, cities pricked with tiny garnet pins, and laid his hands on either side of it like a father consoling a feverish child. "You've come to ask us to do something no one has ever done," Tycho said. Jon looked at the map and then at Tycho and said nothing. "A truce," Tycho continued, as if naming a sea monster to make it smaller. "Between Bravos and Pentos, between Myr and Lys and Tyrosh, between Volantis and Cohor and Norvos and Lorith. A truce enforced not by coin or contract, not by the threat of embargo or the memory of debt, but by a dragon." Tycho's mouth made the shape of the word dragon as if he were biting it in half. Jon remembered the first time he had touched black scale still warm from sun. The heat had seemed like a living answer to all the cold questions he had carried from the wall. Drogon had circled him on the blasted hill above the Dothraki Sea, wind from immense wings flattening the grass. Jon had raised a bare hand because armor tells lies and skin does not. The dragon had leaned, and time had thickened like honey, and Jon had thought, "The world has given me the hardest thing that also happens to be the only thing that might work." "You ask the bank to guarantee it," Tycho said. "You ask us to stake our name. You ask us to move gold like tides." "I ask you," Jon said, "to do what only you can. You make numbers real. You make promises heavy. If the cities believe the bank stands behind the truce, they will measure their greed against the weight of your displeasure." "And the dragon? The dragon is not mine," Jon said, which was true in every way that mattered. "He is his own, but he listens, sometimes, to fire and to blood and to what the world becomes when those are spent. I intend to ask him to be seen, to be known, not as a conqueror's whip, as a boundary." Tycho's dark eyes studied Jon's face with the clinical tenderness of a jeweler considering a flawed stone. "Boundaries require men on both sides to agree where they are." "They will agree," Jon said, "or they will see why they should have." It should have sounded like a threat. It did not, and that was perhaps worse. Jon drank the wine and tasted cloves and something like the bitter after of pine resin. He had not meant to sound tired, but his voice had learned it. "We aren't priests," Tycho said. "We do not crown saviors. We crown the sound of repayment." He tapped the map with a ring finger. "But bronze speaks a language older than ours. If you can make the bronze sing in all these places at once, if you can make a song they all agree is in tune, the bank can hum along." Jon had met kings who mistook metaphors for fealty. Tycho was not one of them. You will assemble them, John said. Not to sign yet, to hear. Tycho inclined his head. Bravos would host, but Bravos is also a city that hates the very idea of chains and yet lives by contracts. Some might call it too convenient. Volantis would trumpet and try to paint the Truce tiger orange. Mir would insist on Clause 3 subparagraph 5 written in their dies. No, the place must be truly inconvenient. It must offend everyone equally. Qohor, John said. It offends even the trees. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. Qohor's black steel smiths, the unsullied that had defended its walls long ago, the forest of Qohor with its leaves like old blood. He had crossed that forest once with a small band of sellswords whose captain had lied about wolves and died by a worse mouth. Tycho's mouth did a small appreciative thing that might have been a smile if it had been born in a warmer country. The bank will send letters, and we will send coin to help every city recall the cost of war. If a man is distracted by profit, he is halfway to compromise. You have a way of making peace sound like another trade, John said. It is the only trade that must always be renewed, Tycho replied. And you, Lord Snow, you will need an emblem. You can. OTB the wall again. You must be a door. He left John with the map and his own thoughts, both of which had the same habit of refusing to stay where he had put them. That night, John walked out into the fog and followed the smell of brine until he reached the shore where the Titan's shadow made the air feel heavier. He called a name that belonged to no man, and far above, a shape unhooked itself from darkness and fell like a piece of night coming loose. Drogon landed with a disdain for the architecture of docks. Timbers jumped. Water leapt back. The dragon's black eyes were close-set and clever, with the same speculative cruelty John had seen in princes who had misunderstood mercy. John did not give commands. He gave explanations. He told Drogon that men were going to meet in a forest where the trees remembered blood and where iron learns to defeat itself. He said there would be ships and banners and the sweet stink of arguments. He said, I will ask you to be terrifying and then to be still. Drogon snorted a small gout of blue-tinged flame as if to say terror and stillness are the same for me. John touched one of the ridges along the dragon's neck, feeling the damp heat of breath, and for a heartbeat a vision edged into his skull. A cage as big as a city, made of oaths. The messengers went out from Bravos like needles threading swollen cloth. Pentos sent a sleek galley with a figurehead carved as a naked woman whose eyes had been replaced with weathered emeralds. Mir sent a longship painted the color of liver. Tyrosh sent a war barge with an offensive number of oars. Lys sent a yacht to demonstrate that inconvenience could be done with taste. Volantis sent 3 ships to avoid being seen to send one. Norvos sent a priest whose beard had been braided into a bell rope. Lorith sent a scholar with ink on all 10 fingers. Qohor, to everyone's disgust, sent an agreement to host. John sailed with a small company that would have made mockery of any king's retinue. Davos Seaworth, who could talk to pirates the way farmers talk to stubborn mules. Missandei of Noth, patient as rain, 2 translators from Pentos whose mutual hatred made them both particularly accurate, and a page from the Iron Bank who wrote everything down in letters so tiny they looked like an infestation. They crossed a sea the color of old coins and came to a city that had been carved from coal. Qohor did not show its teeth until you touched them. The forest hunched beyond like a slow, dark rumor. If the free cities were a ring of controllers arguing over the contents of a chest, Qohor was the chest in which something else had been locked and then forgotten. The delegates arrived over 3 days of ash-gray sky. Pentos came with scented parchment and smiles. Mir came with contracts that doubled as threats. Tyrosh came with dyed silk, so expensive it looked like it wasn't wearing itself. Lys came with a rumble of laughter and eyes like knives. Volantis came with the echo of drums and tigers watching from behind the lids of men. Norvos came with bells and small frowns that did not change. Lorith came as if permission were a puzzle they enjoyed solving. Bravos arrived with the air of a creditor visiting a favorite debtor's wedding. Only Qohor was already here, the city's blacksmiths continuing to work in locust-slow rhythm that smelled like men trying to turn iron into history. The opening formalities were exactly as terrible as everyone expected. John did not try to speak more than necessary. He watched them the way he had once watched men at the wall when the rime crept down their beards. to see who shivered and who pretended not to. A Myrish envoy named Shivan spoke with the practiced smile of a man who had borrowed his lips. "We are pleased to consider the prospect of a cessation of hostilities," he said, and the air filled with the sound of quills being lifted. Pleased, consider, prospect, cessation. So much safety tucked between so many hedges. Our artisans cannot design beauty if they are forever remaking swords. "A truce would be good for trade," said the Tyroshi woman, whose hair had been dyed a blue so deep it looked like a bruise. "We have a new method for dyeing silk that, well, I suppose we could show you if we weren't all too busy healing from the last skirmish. Bravos has always abhorred slavery," the Bravosi delegate said, as if clarifying the weather. "A truce that reduces the demand for chains. We find it attractive." "List does not traffic in chains," said the Lysini ambassador without blinking. "We traffic in choice." "Volantis traffics in memory," said the Valentine Triarch who wore his house's tiny tusks pierced through the ear. "We remember the old empire. In memory, there is order. In order, there is peace. In peace, there are contracts," said the man from the Iron Bank. "And in contracts," the Nervashi priest said, "there are bells. What are the terms?" Shivan asked finally, the way a man asks the price of quiet. "Simple," John said, letting Missandei's translation carry the calm. "No city takes another's land by force. No privateer in one's pay attacks the other's ships. Letters of marque are suspended. No slave is taken from any ship in waters covered by the truce. No mercenary company crosses a border without consent of both sides." He paused, "And a dragon enforces it." They waited for him to elaborate. The silence stretched until even the trees seemed to lean closer. "You wish to deploy a beast as if it were written law," the Lorati scholar said, licking his ink-stained thumb. "What is to stop it from being deployed for someone's private law?" "For you. It won't be," John said. "How can we believe that?" The Tyroshi woman said, "Dragons follow the rider. Riders follow their hearts. Hearts follow, well, that's why we dye silk." Missandei glanced at John, and John shook his head slightly. He could not make them trust him by explaining himself. Trust was not a word. It was a weather. Ash. He walked away from the table while they were still talking and stepped out onto the dark flagstones beyond the hall. The sky had clouded from iron to pewter. The forest waited like an audience that had read the play before. He called, and the answer arrived not as a roar but as an absence of distance. Drogon came low, his shadow making everything look like it had been drawn on. The city shuddered. Men screamed because men scream when the world shows them how small they were all along. The dragon landed on the blackened plaza with a contempt that justified all previous contempts, and John went to him with the same deliberate slowness with which he had once let a dying man's hand slide from his. He did not mount. He faced the delegates with Drogon's shoulder behind him like a hill that breathed. "This is not a leash," John said. "It's a scale." He looked to Missandei, who translated with a softness that made the words sound less like iron. "You weigh your choices against it. You build your markets against it. You teach your children to count knowing this is in the sum." Volantis's Triarch frowned. "And if a city breaks your truce, then you will smell it before you see it," John said. "He will not burn cities. He will not cook men as food. He will make it impossible to ignore that the cost is greater than the profit. A city that breaks the truce will have to move its ships under a sky that hates the taste of sails. A lord who hires swords across a border will find those swords livelier in the wrong places. Warehouses will unlearn their appetite for flame when flames have eyes. You speak as if this creature can be told to be precise," Shivan said, the word hanging like a bauble in a different light. "He will be as precise as we are honest," John said, and felt the forest receive the sentence like a witness. The days that followed made the word haggling look heroic. They argued the borderlines with the zeal priests reserved for the number of angels on pinheads. They wrote clauses within clauses until any one of them could have been assigned as a short apprenticeship in madness. In the nights, John walked in the forest of Qohor, where the red leaves did not whisper so much as remember out loud. Once, he came upon 3 unsullied standing perfectly still around a pool, so still it seemed to have caught the sky like a thief catches a ring. He stood with them until dawn, and none of them spoke, because none of them had the kind of story that is improved by being told. On the 5th day, a messenger arrived panting like a cheated gambler. A Volantene fleet and a Lycini consortium had broken each other's vows outside the Turtle Isles. Cargo burned, men bled, and by morning the sea would likely be full of both. The two delegations denied, explained, justified, and called the messenger a liar with such precision that the lie took on an attractive shape. "Send for your dragon," the Tyroshi woman said flatly. "If your scale weighs, let it weigh." John did not need to send. Drogon had already lifted himself from the south like a night-soaked mountain that had found wings. John climbed bareback, hands on spine. The wind hooked itself in his cloak and then thought better of the idea. From above, Qohor was a blister on black, the forest a clot. The sea opened its mouth in a way that made flight feel less like escape and more like a bargain. They saw the two fleets at once because it was impossible not to. The Lycini ships were painted like fruit. The Volantene vessels were proud and prolonged and looked like they could climb onto land and continue being ships without anyone's permission. Fire climbed the rigging of two, and men leapt like punctuation. "Easy," John said to a mind that knew him as a warmth resemblance. "No feast, no city, teeth only where law ends." They came down like the correction to a long sum. Drogon roared, not the great bellow that breaks bone in the ear, but the narrower, thinner sound that a knife makes when kissed by a stone. He lanced fire, not into sails or men or decks, but into the sea itself. It hissed like a lie. Steam rose and then crashed down, smothering. The flame ate wind before it could eat wood. Men who had been ready to pray to the Mother or the Lord of Light or to jewels or to coin found themselves praying to the notion that intention might matter. John directed Drogon between the two fleets like threading a horse through a drunken village. The dragon's wings beat a rhythm that made archers forget what bows were for. When one Lycini warship tried to use the confusion to spit grapnels at a Volantene trader, Drogon banked and placed a tongue of fire so close to the grapnel ropes that the hemp thought it had been told a joke and let go. "Go home," John shouted, and he did not know whether he meant the men or himself. After, they drifted above the sea as the two fleets clattered away in directions that had escaped their maps. John stroked the ridge, and Drogon made a sound that was Disgust's cousin. They returned to Qohor mottled with salt. The arguments that evening were different. Not shorter, but different. The delegates handled their words like men handling knives they had seen used. A clause was added that stated the dragon was not to be used to advantage one city over another. If the dragon failed to appear when called to enforce the truce, the city calling would levy penalties against the bank that had guaranteed the agreement. Tycho's face did not change. The bank accepted the risk as if accepting were another form of charging interest. When they wrote their names at last, the act did not feel like magic. It felt like carpentry. The ironwood table had grooves carved by the hands of men who regretted things and kept living. Missandei pressed the wax with John's seal. A direwolf and a dragon facing each other like two kinds of hunger learning a compromise. There was no cheering. The free cities did not cheer for anything but profit. They did, however, begin to act as if something had become slightly easier to admit. The truce spread not like a feast, but like a road. Lists were drawn. Prices were set that did not punish the other cities simply for existing. Sel's words found themselves hired to guard shipments instead of steal them, and discovered grudgingly that the pay for not dying could be quite good. Pirate captains who had built lives on nimbleness found that their nimbleness had to learn new shapes when a shadow could erase a wake. There were violations. There are always violations. A Tyroshi syndicate tried to cheat the metrics by hiring Lorati smugglers to use a string of small islands with names like coughs. Drogon appeared one morning and landed upon those islands one by one until the men waiting there found themselves hating coconuts as if they had been betrayed by a sermon. In Norvos, a minor bell had to be rung when a baron attempted to bind half of Pentos to a debt with language so ornate it tried to distract from its cruelty. John arrived with Missandei and a Bravosi advocate and a sack of bread, and the city changed their minds more easily than expected because changing minds is cheaper than rebuilding burnt harbors. It would have been easy to pretend that a dragon made men better. John did not pretend. He saw fear do the heavy lifting, and he did not reward it for muscle it already had. Instead, he went to the places where the truce felt thin and asked questions. Not just to triarchs and magisters and princes of coin, to stevedores who could show you a splinter without looking at their hands, to girls who wove sweetgrass into rope and had counted the boats, to sailors who had named every wind and still feared the sudden one. In Pentos, he found a boy whose father had been killed in a skirmish that now would never happen, which is to say the man had died for something that had been declared impossible. The boy did not forgive the present for defining the past. John sat with him in a kitchen that smelled like faint cinnamon and stronger onions and told him about ghosts you don't invite but who come anyway. The boy listened and then asked if the dragon could bring people back. John said no. The boy's shoulders told him they had already known. In Mir, an artisan showed him a vial of blue dye so rare that the color seemed to lean away from the light rather than reflect it. We used to pour this into water to watch the river go holy before a battle, the man said without embarrassment. Now we pour it on silk. It is a different prayer. Do your priests approve? I have no priests, John said, and the craftsman believed him, which surprised them both. In Lys, a woman with a voice like a white stone kept by a child as a talisman explained that the Guild of Pleasures would be ruined if men refused to cross borders. John replied, mildly, that pleasure had always been better at crossing borders than any guild. Later that night, Drogon circled the city enough times to be rumored and then was gone, making the scent of saffron feel briefly like a warning. It was in Volantis that the truce was truly tested. The new Red Temple had found a new voice to replace the old. Bonero had been a drum too often struck. This voice belonged to a woman called Eva, whose eyes had the joyless shine of men who discovered a secret and then could never forgive the world for not having told them sooner. Eva looked at John and saw not a savior but a rival, and she spoke to the city with the fierce love of someone trying to correct a child who didn't exist. We have made truce with men who do not honor the Lord of Light. Eva thundered from the steps of the temple whose columns had been painted as flames. We have built our city on rules crafted by unbelievers and enforced by a beast whose obedience is claimed by a man who says he died and yet does not show us his scars. We risk becoming a city that confuses the absence of war with the presence of virtue. John asked to meet her privately. He had learned that speeches are best answered with rooms. They sat in a chamber behind the sanctum, candles doing what candles do in places where gods have been told they are welcome. I do not want your city to be virtuous, John said. I want it to be quieter. Quiet is not a virtue, Eva said. No, but it is sometimes the condition for one. She leaned forward, hands folded. You are a man who believes in conditions. Very well, Lord Snow, if that is the name you prefer. What do you tell yourself at night that allows you to demand so much of other people's fear? That it should buy something, John said. When I burned with cold and fire and came back, I learned that fear is a coin no one can refuse. The truce asks that the coin be spent where it buys time, for ships to pass, for men to live, for children to grow tired of words like border and tariff and raid, and for the bank, she said, to grow fat. The bank would grow fat if the world ended, John said. It is their nature. Our natures are worse when we pretend they are otherwise. She surprised him by smiling. It was exhausted and hardly changed her face, but it was there. Very well, she said. You are not a liar. That will disappoint my enemies. I will disappoint them in other ways. She quieted her temple's objection to the truce, which is to say she changed the questions she asked in public. Volantis settled like silk in a chest. Men don't cheer for peace. They gossip about it. The gossip served. Months became lengths of rope coiled in different shapes. The truce held the way a beam holds, creaking, complaining, and refusing to become something else. Letters reached John from the north, brought by ships that still made time a geography. Sansa's script told him of winter's moods and Council's smaller wars. Arya's hand appeared once without explanation and said simply, if a dragon looks at you too long, remind it that you are boring. Davos's letters always seemed to include the weather of foreplace. At once. Missandei wrote for herself, and sometimes she wrote for the truce, the difference between those two being only where the words chose to sit. There was one more test, because there is always. It came from the worst possible and therefore unsurprising direction. not from abroad, but from within Bravos itself. A syndicate of shipwrights who had lost quiet profits when pirates lost work had quietly funded 3 captains to resume old habits under new names, trusting that the Truce's enforcement shadow did not fall so darkly at the edges. They raided a Pentoshi caravan off the Three Sisters and left the signature of wind more than spear, so it would look like accident. It might have gone unanswered if not for a girl who had been promised a certain amount of bread by a certain man if a certain cargo made it to a certain dock. She spoke to her mother, who cleaned a room where a clerk from the Iron Bank liked to leave one drawer open because the sound comforted him. The mother told the clerk that her daughter's stomach hurt. The clerk closed the drawer, which made him less comfortable, and listened. The bank approached Tycho with the calm of a man reporting a broken abacus. Tycho sent for John with the urgency of a man preparing to be told there had been a flood and then ordered basins. They sat again in that room with the beeswax candles and the map like a wound. Tycho told John what had been done by people whose names he knew and faces he had dined beside. He looked smaller than John had ever seen him. "You guarantee the truce?" John said. "Yes," Tycho said in a voice without whine. "If you do nothing, the cities learn the guarantee is theater." "Yes." "Do you want me to burn your ships?" John asked, and there was no insult in it because he meant it the way surgeons ask about limb and life. Tycho closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something almost like relief in them, which frightened John more than anger would have. "No, burn the names." They did not call a public council. They did not ring bells. They did something more cruel. Drogon landed not at a harbor but at a counting house. Men with ink on their fingers dropped their nibs because ink remembers. John read out the names of the 3 captains on a square where accounts were usually read, and for each name, Drogon exhaled a slow, narrow flame that turned a single ledger page to ash without singing the bindings. The city watched and calculated at the speed of rumor. Then the dragon burned 3 empty ships whose hulls had been paid for with the secrets everyone had pretended not to know. It took an hour. Fire can be taught patience when taught by consequence. The truce did not become immortal. Nothing does, but it learned to stand up to its own reflection. The free cities began to speak of truce as if it were weather one could depend upon. Inconvenient, sometimes ruinous, but real. Pirates found other industries. A dreadfully large number of them became importers of spices and came to argue moral philosophy about the pricing of pepper in a way that made honest men want to take up raiding simply to end the conversation. Sellswords retired earlier and built houses that were defensible because a man never unlearns the shape of danger. For a while, the price of slaves in Volantis dropped because the demand had lowered sheaves of collusion. Then the price began to collapse for a quieter reason. Men saw new profit in keeping their hands clean, and culture tends to track profit the way boats track channels. John visited each city more than once, not to be celebrated, but to be endured. He learned the places where his name was a door and the places where it was a draft. In Bravos, children drew dragons on walls and then scolded them for being rude. In Qohor, a blacksmith, the same, or his son, or a very precise rumor, showed John a piece of steel that had been folded until it remembered being something else, and called it Truce knife, not because it could pierce peace, but because it could separate lies from fat. In Pentos, a woman asked him to bless her baby. He said he did not know how. She said, "You must," and pressed the child into his arms. The baby sneezed and looked agreeable about the future. There was a day, a gray, unremarkable day, when John realized the truce no longer belonged to him. It had become something people had opinions about without asking for his. It had become a topic that tired men could complain of as if complaining could change it. It had earned the most fragile honor a plan can earn, being taken for granted. He walked to Bravosi Quay just before dawn when the fish stink is so honest it becomes almost clean, and he looked up to see Drogon perched on the edge of a warehouse roof like an unwelcome gargoyle. The dragon watched him as one might watch a pebble remembering it had once skipped. "You should go," John said. Drogon striped the morning with a gust of heat that did not touch him. John felt in his bones the same sensation he had felt when Ghost vanished into snow without instruction. Not loss, not relief, not pride. A truer word that has never been needed because it cannot be said. The dragon launched himself with the contempt that always made men love him more in stories than in light. And then he was a black cut in the sky, and then he was less, and then he was weather. John returned to the bank that afternoon because some goodbyes deserved to be calculated alongside ledgers. Tycho met him at the door and looked at his face and did not ask. They went to the small room with the candles as if it had been waiting for them the whole time. "The truce will hold," Tycho said after a while, looking at the map not as a wound but as a healed scab that still itches when rain comes. "Not because we wish it, because men have redrawn their appetites to fit it. It will be broken," John said, "often, smallly, sometimes loudly, but it will have to be broken instead of assumed." Tycho poured wine, and did not offer it this time. He set it in front of John and pretended to tidy his papers. "What will you do now?" "Go home," John said, "if the ship can find it." "Ships always find home," Tycho said, which was the kind of optimism money awards itself. He hesitated, then added, "Some men do not." They did not embrace. They were not those men. John left the bank with nothing he had not brought in except a different weight to his shoulders and a misremembered song in his head that had lately been called policy. He walked through Bravos with the sensation of moving through a story that someone else had already told him. Children ran by bearing sticks that they held the way heroes hold swords. In the shadow of a fishmonger's stall, a woman with a scarf across her hair waved a knife in the direction of a man and scolded him in a voice that would have made any god reconsider its pronouns. The man laughed and kissed her wrist. Life was a series of risks badly described. On the pier, Davos waited with his practical patience. He looked at John and then at the sky, which wore the expression of a man who has found a coin he dropped last year. "Leaving then?" Davos said. "Yes. Suppose I could try and say something wise about the sea teaching you what land never does," Davos said. "But the sea taught me if you don't step onto the boat, it leaves without you. Come on." They sailed as night was rubbing itself into morning, the Titan's roar sounding the way a memory forgets what it was originally supposed to prevent. Missandei stood at the prow, hair bound against the wind, and spoke to the waves in Nathi, which made them behave, if only out of curiosity. The ship cut the water the way decisions cut time. Not well, not cleanly, but forward. When they were a day out, the wind died. The sea lay flat as a sentence that refuses to end. John stood with Davos beneath a sky that had reassigned its stars according to rules only it understood. "You did it," Davos said, and because he was Davos, he said it like pointing out the location of a difficult shoal. "You made a thing that keeps other things from happening. That's rarer than glory." "I didn't do it," John said. "We pushed on a door everyone was already leaning against." "Then you were the hinge," Davos said. "Hinges are what keep the world from being only choices and consequences." John let himself smile, which felt a little like remembering a place he had never been. He thought of the forest of Qohor, and the way the leaves had said nothing and everything. He thought of Sansa's steady script, Arya's brief word, the north like a hand he still wore without noticing. He thought of a dragon whose shadow had taught men to measure their appetites against something that could not be paid. By dawn, the wind returned as if it had only stepped ashore for a drink. The sails filled with a sound like relief learning to sing. Oars were shipped, and the ship moved forward again. Not fast, not slow, at the true speed of men who had not lied to themselves about what waits at journey's end. Home would not make him king. It would not burn for him or bow for him or explain him. But there would be bread and bells and small arguments, and then larger ones, and a sky that did not care if he found his answer because it was busy being a sky. He could live in that. Toward evening, a gull landed on the rail and stared with the shameless entitlement of gulls everywhere. Its beak clicked like a clerk's abacus. John offered it a crumb from a biscuit Davos swore was a delicacy in White Harbor, and which had all the elegance of a paving stone. The gull considered him, cocked its head, and then took the crumb, flying off at a speed that implied it had just been paid a debt long owed. Missandei came to stand beside him. "I do not know how stories will tell what we have done," she said. "They will say it was the dragon. They will say it was the bank. They will say it was the fear men had of losing coin." "They will be right," John said. "They will say it was you." "They will be wrong," John said, quietly, And they will be right. I was someone who lived long enough to be used by a purpose. The world is kinder when that happens. Missandei nodded. Perhaps the world is kinder when men allow it. They stayed there until the light did that trick it does where the sea thinks it owns it. Night came on like someone finally agreeing about something. In the distance, if one had the right kind of stubbornness in one's eyes, one could imagine a dragon's silhouette briefly chalked against a moon and then gone. Less than rumor, more than wish. John went below and slept for the first time in weeks without hearing the sound of contracts being signed or sales unlearning their fear. He dreamt of the wall, not as it had been, but as a long white page on which someone could write anything. The handwriting was messy and full of crossings out. It looked like his. When he woke, the ship was pointing toward a line on the horizon that, if coaxed with patience, would become land. Davos was humming in a key that made the boat feel sturdier. The crew spoke the language that sailors always speak when the wind is good and the food is not, and the captain is someone who can admit that both are true. Jon Snow stood at the rail and watched the morning. He did not feel like a king or a savior or a general or even a hinge. He felt like a man who had learned that some doors must be held not because of what lies beyond, but because of what might flood through if they are left to swing as they please. The sea swelled and then calmed, and the sky hung above with the effortless virtue of things that do not need purposes to exist. Somewhere behind him, across a stretch of water that had become a treaty, the free cities went about their business. Bells were rung in Norvos with the same lack of irony as always. Myrish dyers dipped silk into basins and argued whether the blue was the color of certainty or the color of forgetting. In Tyrosh, a man counted up his profits and found to his alarm that he could not blame war for the losses he had incurred by his own greed. In the way of men, he began to blame the truce. In Bravos, a clerk closed his favorite drawer and found that he preferred the sound of it shut. In Qohor, the forest did not move, but everything else did, in hundreds of ways made more possible by something large that had chosen where to sit. And somewhere even further, in a sky that had never been anybody's, a black shadow wrote its own story upon the light and then refused to be seen until it wanted to be again. Jon curled his hands over the rail and thought, with a clarity that felt like winter air, that he could live in a world where men paused, just briefly, before they reached for their swords. It was not a promise of kindness. It was not a cure. It was a boundary. Sometimes boundaries make more room. The ship slid forward, the wake writing itself and then being rewritten by the sea as if to prove that no story survives its reader. The gull returned and scolded him without remorse, and Jon laughed. A small sound that felt like a better kind of truce, one made with himself. With the man who had died and the man who had done the arithmetic and the man who now faced a home that had not asked for his absence but would nonetheless have to learn how to carry his return. He stood there a long time, and the day went on doing what days do when not watched, becoming another one. The river's color turned from pewter to slate, and then to a blue so thin it felt like a rumor of spring laid over winter's old bones. The crew spoke less as the coast resolved itself from that horizon line into the low green smudges that become fields and headlands and memories. When the lighthouse at White Harbor finally showed its steady blink. 1, 2, the measured reassurance of men who had decided to keep vigil even when nobody was watching. Davos took a long breath and let it out like a man putting down a sack he had carried farther than he'd promised himself he could. They came in on a tide that seemed reluctant to admit them, as if the Manderley harbor had learned to be careful about anything that returned with a story. Men on the quay called to each other in the matter-of-fact way Northerners reserve for miracles. Ropes flew, bumpers squeaked against timbers, gulls argued with the certainty of priests. Jon stood at the rail, the smell of brine and tar telling his bones more about where he was than any tower or banner could. Missandei watched the city watch them, her face quiet and curious in equal measure. Wyman Manderley's grandnephew, Ser Richard, awaited them with a welcome that was neither perfumed nor stingy. Fires banked to heat wine without boiling it, bread still steaming in its broken halves, a slab of smoked fish cut with a knife that had opinions. Ser Richard was too young to have forgotten any war and too old to imagine he would see no more. He said none of the things courtiers say when they see a man's name walking around in flesh. He bowed to Davos as if to a craftsman whose work he recognized. and to Missandei as if she were a new kind of compass that might point toward a gentler north. When he turned to John, he simply said, "My lady sends carts." "My lady?" John asked, but of course Sansa had already been here. The carts rolled up with a reasonable number of blankets and an unreasonable number of jars. Pickled beets, pickled onions, pickled fish, pickled arguments preserved in brine. It was how the North protected itself from hunger and from the subtler famine of forgetting the taste of things. A small girl clung to the back of one cart with the boldness of children who have never had to learn what not to touch. She stared at Missandei and then grinned, delighted to discover a face she had not accounted for. They rode for Winterfell with the sky doing that half-gray, half-open thing it does when it is uncertain whether to be cruel or practical. The castle showed itself first as smoke, then as wall, then as home. Jon's boots found old memories in the stone. His hands remembered the timber where they had once stolen splinters. Sansa met him in the yard with that small tilt of her chin that meant she had been carrying things too heavy for too long and had not dropped any of them on anyone's foot. "You've made Essos quieter," she said later in the solar, when the hearth snapped like a beast settling into a comfortable kill. "The ravens argue whether you've made it wiser. I suppose ravens would." She poured him a cup she had sweetened on his behalf, because she remembered he would pretend to like it if she did not. "There will be envoys. They already came to White Harbor. Some of them think to plant their flags in our courtyards and call them embassies. I told them we have no courtyards for flags. We could spare a small one," Jon said, and her quick look made him smile. It was not the kind of smile that forgoes sorrow. It was the kind that refuses to add to it. He told her what he could in the shortness of time before duty turned conversation into a road with milestones. He spoke of Cohor's iron and of the forest that remembered, of Volantis and its new priestess who had taught a city to argue about virtue and silence in the same breath, of Tycho and his map, of the way men's appetites had been measured against a shadow until the shadow had seemed as natural as winter. Sansa listened the way she always had, with her eyes moving to the corners of the room as if she were seating guests in an order that would prevent knives from being an improvement to anyone's hand. When he told her that Drogon had gone in that way beasts do when their going is not a departure but a resumption, she set the cup down and let her fingers rest against the table as if warming a memory there. "Good," she said. "It is better for the world that no one believes a dragon sleeps in our stables. Better for us that we remember we do not have one to call." He slept that night in a chamber that had once smelled like boy sweat and dog, and then for a while like plans, and then like something scorched. It smelled now like wood and lavender. Ghost came and went, which was how Ghost had always said everything there was to say. Jon woke before dawn with the sensation of having argued with someone he could not see. He went out into the yard and watched Frost choose where to sit. The sky offered up its first light like a man remembering a name. Envoys did come, and more quickly than would have been decent in a better world. They arrived as if worried the North might change its mind about existing. A Braavosi clerk with a receding hairline and a rising sense of self-importance presented a roll of parchment with so many ribbons it seemed to have dandruff. He insisted on reading out the clauses in Braavosi law that, by the clerk's reckoning, made the North a party to nothing but good sense. Sansa heard him and then took him to see the weirwood in the Godswood. He returned pale and decided to be less precise. From Myr came a woman named Renya who carried a small lacquered box and would not say what was in it until she determined whether any northerner deserved the knowing. From Pentos came a prince by courtesy and a merchant by honesty, whose hands had ink stains and scar lines in the same places. From Tyrosh came a man in a cloak so blue it burned the eyes. He announced that Tyrosh would be happy to advise Winterfell on dyes if Winterfell would only learn to listen to Silk. From Lorith came a scholar with the air of a man more interested in Winterfell stones than in Winterfell stances. Norvos sent no one. It rang a small bell and considered itself represented. Jon met them all with the politeness of a man who had learned that disdain wastes time. He walked them through the great hall and across the yard where the cold remembers footsteps. He showed them the place where Bran had once fallen and the places where men had once been lifted into graves. He spoke softly, and they had to seat their eagerness if they wanted to hear. Missandei stood beside him often, smoothing translations as one smooths a coverlet over a restless sleeper. What we offer the free cities is not the North's strength, John told the Pentoshi merchant, whose name was Marigo and whose eyes had learned to count from a mother who had learned from hunger. We offer them a place to speak that is not theirs. We offer them a hearth that does not know their dialects of greed. That makes it easier for their better arguments to hear themselves. Marigo nodded slowly. If they want the North to be a hinge, they must remember it isn't a door, he said, gratifyingly. Still, there will be those who push. They will find stone, John said. We are made of it. Word reached them within a fortnight of something not yet a disaster but already large enough to cast a different light on men's faces. In the Stepstones, the jagged, tide-torn litter of islands where too many ships had always gone to learn what competence meant. Two captains had raised the old colors of a cooperation that had once made the seas unprofitable for everyone but itself. The triarchy had existed in a dozen shapes and under 100 names. It lived in the desire of men from Mir and Lys and Tyrosh to make their neighbor's success into their own crest. This time, it wore courtesy and spoke of keeping lanes safe where pirates had grown fat. Men like safety when profit is counted near at hand. Men who have already paid for safety sometimes despise those who sell it too cheaply later. The free cities bickered in letters like old men recalling grudges they had only recently put down. Renya of Mir sat across from John that evening at a side table in the Great Hall, while the rest of the envoys pretended not to overhear each other. She had opened the lacquered box. Inside lay a small glass vial containing a dye so deep a blue it seemed to look back. We know the smell of our own schemes, she said. The Triarchs never die. They shed their names like skins. Some of them are my cousins. Some of them have bought supper for my children. She touched the vial with a tenderness that did not make it less deadly. They mean to call your dragon and then call you a tyrant when you answer. They will call me worse things if I don't, John said. Then don't let them call you at all, she said. Make someone else blow the horn. That winter, the sea favored no one. Gales ran out of the east with the obstinacy of small kings. Sleet taught sails to speak new profanities. On the first clear day after 3 of mud and sorrow, a single ship bearing Bervosi colors came into White Harbor with 3 men on her deck and fear crouched in her hold. They asked to speak to the Lord of Winterfell as men ask a surgeon to speak in a hurry. John heard them in the room where the stone smoke always hangs high, so the low air is safe for talk. The youngest of the 3, a sailor with hands like rope burns, did most of the telling because he hadn't learned to be careful yet. 3 Triarchy captains had used the Stepstones to levy a private tax on all who passed, and they had done it with a ceremony meant to look like law. Banners, declarations, ermines stolen from courts that didn't know they'd been present. A Cohoric trader had refused and been taken with her whole cargo. A Lysini bark that hadn't paid enough had been relieved of its masts. Then a Pentoshi galley had resisted and men had died in a number too useful to ignore. They say they enforce your truce, the sailor said, his voice rising with the disguised panic of men who don't want to weep. They say the dragon will reward them. They've painted one on a sail. Sansa's eyes went to John's and found there the thought she had already catalogued. If you answer, she said later, when they were alone, they will make you the steel at the end of their contracts. If you do not, your name becomes a bauble chief's hang around their necks. Drogon isn't a horn, John said. He is a fact. Then make the fact point at them, she said, not at the world. They convened a small council that did not smell like incense or fear, merely wood smoke and the wool of men's cloaks steaming into the air. Davos traced the Stepstones with a piece of charcoal on a map Sansa had copied so often the parchment had learned the shape of its own coastlines. They always think sitting here makes them kings, he said, tapping a channel as narrow as a priest's generosity. They always forget storms make mockery of kings. But a dragon doesn't care if waves are high. Then we won't have him burn, John said. We will have him count. Missandei looked at him with the small brief approval she reserved for when he had said something that mattered and had not made a fuss about it. If you do it in the Stepstones, you do it in a place that thinks itself a court, she said. Let it be a trial without witnesses except the sea. The dawn they chose offered up a sky the color of ash. John stood on the high ground of the largest of the 3 islands where the Triarchy had arranged its market in virtue. The captains had made a show of it. Tables, ledgers, a banner stitched with a dragon so incompetently that even a child would hate it for the lie. The men stood under it with the sour confidence spawned by success acquired too easily. Wearing good cloaks and mean faces, they received John with the wary respect paid to storms farther offshore. "You enforced the truce?" the chief among them said. He had a Myrish accent when it benefited him and a Lycini one when it didn't. "We assist. The sea is large, Lord Snow. A dragon has only 2 eyes." "Enough," John said. "What did you say?" The man asked, hand shifting near the hilt of a sword with stones in the pommel cut to look expensive from a distance. "Enough," John said again, and lifted his face. Drogon had learned to come from below men's expectations. He did not blot out the sun. He drew a line across it like a scribe's stroke correcting an error. He settled on the rocky rise with a care that felt like contempt, and the wind from his wings kicked up the captain's fine cloaks in a way that made them sully themselves, stamping them down. "No," John said to Drogon, and the dragon gave him an offended look that would have made kings reconsider their upholstery. "Count." The men laughed, and then they stopped laughing, which is how counting often works. Drogon blew, not fire that burned, but heat that bent. He passed his breath over the ranks of ships anchored in the Narrows until the tension in their lines became visible as if carried by a thread of silver. The heat kissed the tops of masts, and a dozen stayed steady. Then 1, then 2, then 3, those whose captains had used their anchor chains as if they ruled tides. Jerked, skated, drifted, until they lay cocked crosswise, harmless to everyone except themselves. Sailors yelled in a dozen accents and then stopped yelling when they realized the sea had been turned into an account book. Drogon drew another line, and the heat hardened the tar at the seams of certain boats where it had been thinned by a captain proud of his thrift. The seams cracked. Water seeped like shame. Men ran with buckets not because their ships were sinking, but because they could see that the sea had learned how to look. "Pay," John said to the captains, and let them hear the word they had given to others. "Pay the cities you've taken from. Pay the sailors you called pirates to steal their skill. Pay the children you have orphaned with your bad arithmetic. Or what?" the chief asked, with that small, ridiculous lift of his chin that men give to fate when they exalt themselves. "Or you will not be able to count your losses fast enough to stop them," John said, and Drogon curved his neck like a question mark that had found its answer in a man's throat. To their credit, which is to say in credit's ultimate indictment, they paid. They paid quickly. The triarchy is a shape men's greed takes. It does not survive men's fear when the fear is shown numbers. The captains tried to smile as if they had always intended to be generous. The smile is a banner that surrenders more territory than tears. John watched their men count out coins, and he saw in each motion the argument becoming rumor. He left them with their banner drooping like a truth told too late. Drogon lifted, and the island shook decorously, like a house of decency making room for sin to leave by the front door. They flew once more over the ships and gave the men below a last deep lesson. The dragon's shadow fell across each deck and then moved on, measuring. In Winterfell, Sansa read the letter drafted by the Triarchy's temporary humility and raised an eyebrow at the clauses in which the captains tried to praise the North without staining their own names. "It will not last," she said. "It does not need to," John said. "It needs to last long enough to make the next liar work harder." The envoys thinned. Renya of Myr left the lacquered box as if she'd forgotten it. Sansa placed it in the storeroom where things never opened sit with dignity. The Braavosi clerk departed with fewer ribbons, which made him look more like a person. Marigo of Pentos made a last circuit of the yard, noticing the cracks in stone and the way the wind used the archways to save itself effort. He had the air of a man trying to memorize something he could not carry. The Lority scholar stayed until the first snows, ink staining his fingers with drawings of battlements and birds. He left a paper on Sansa's desk describing the castle's acoustics in a hand so careful it might have been prayer. Sansa smiled at the notes once, found in them an affection that had never names, and put them in the drawer where she kept small forgivenesses. John tried to live. He rose to the SME. LLS of porridge and smoke, of leather, of men thinking in the yard with swords. He ate meals that were never quite warm enough. which is how you know you're not a king. He heard petitions, and the sound of them reminded him of waves. Some complaints were small and would melt of their own accord if left in a kinder climate. Some were sharp and meant to pry apart a door he had never closed. He settled disputes over land and stubborn oxen and men who had never learned to speak truth to their mothers, and thus tried to learn too late to speak it to their wives. He walked the godswood where the weirwood had the same expression it had always had. The one that says it sees you as you are and yet is not bored. A raven arrived bearing a strip of red wax stamped with a tiger's mouth open just enough to show only customarily alarming teeth. Volantis wrote in Eva's hand. The truce had become a word in their prayers, which had both softened and sharpened them in ways she found interesting. A minor riot had been avoided when the price of pepper had found a rational floor. She did not say she had quietly threatened to open the temple kitchens to feed those who might otherwise have been paid to make noise. She asked whether Noth had ever known winters as cruel as Volantis when the river turned the color of lead. Missandei read the letter twice and then went to the rookery to write one of her own. She sent it not to Eva, but to 3 small girls in a village where the wind learns to taste flowers before it tastes salt. Arya returned to Winterfell as she did everything. Fast, quiet, and without preliminary apology. She came in through a gate no one was watching because everyone had been told once that it did not exist. She smelled of travel and bread eaten standing and the kind of fear that keeps men honest. Sansa watched her eat and only afterward asked what she had been seeing. Faces? Arya said, which is the sort of answer that is either too much or perfectly sufficient. She looked at Jon with an appraisal that felt like being measured for sin. It's a neat thing you've made, she said. This truce. Neat things are easy to snatch. I know, Jon said. You'll need eyes that don't blink, she said, and for a moment the child who had once run with a stick like a sword crossed her face. And then the woman who had learned knives in a place that trains men to confess without words returned. Braavos has too many of them already. I didn't ask the kindly ones to bless anything, Jon said. They don't bless, she said, and took another piece of bread as if it had offended her. She stayed through 2 snows and a thaw. She watched Jon arbitrate a boundary dispute between men with noses red enough to be poverty's heraldry, and she told a story afterward about a Pentoshi fence made of colored glass that had convinced 2 neighbors the border was prettier than the land. She spoke with Missandei in a corner where the light hit the seam between wall and floor in a way that made dust look holy. They laughed at something private and then did not share the laughter with Jon when he wandered by, which felt like the first time in weeks he had not been asked to be useful. Ghost paced the wall walks at night and came to lie with his great head on Jon's boot when the wind from the west assured the castle that bad weather had remembered it. Sometimes Jon rose from the bench outside the kennel and went to the godswood and stood under the weirwood. The face did not change. It would not have been the godswood if it did. He whispered nothing. It felt like honesty. The letter that changed the winter did not come wrapped in a seal or on good vellum. It came in the weary hand of a second clerk in the counting room of a guild in Braavos that made its coin by enforcing rules about the size of casks used to carry pickled eels. The clerk liked the sound the drawer made when it closed. He had written to Tycho once about a stomachache and been rewarded with a certain sense that what he knew might sometimes be wanted in a better room. He wrote to Missandei by way of an address Davos had taught him, which promised his letter would find a woman who knew how to make words sit down. In a paragraph without flourishes, the clerk laid out a simple truth. A narrow faction within the Iron Bank, men who had learned to see risk as a prey animal that could be domesticated, had quietly extended debt to 3 consortiums in 3 cities with the understanding that war, not truce, would fatten those notes. The men were not fools. They had not spoken the word war aloud. They had called it rebalancing the maritime advantage gradient. They were the kind of men who believed words made them safe. They had begun to whisper that the truce had done its work and now must be sunset. If the bank was a city of numbers, then an alley of that city had decided to ignore its streetlights. Missandei read the letter and handed it to Jon without speaking. Sansa read it after him and rubbed her thumb across the script so lightly she did not smudge it. Davos took the letter and turned it over as if the back might confess an additional sin. Arya took it last, read it once, and memorized the careless loop of a single read that would serve her as a door latch later. If the guarantee fails, The truce becomes a fashion, Sansa said. Fashion kills fewer men than famine, Davos said. But it does not feed any, either. You cannot go to Bravos and tell them to keep their word because of their word, Missandei said. Bravos thinks itself immune to sermons. It believes itself the author of sermons. Then we'll show them a calculation, Jon said. He did not call a host. He took a ship. The narrow sea between White Harbor and Bravos had grown friendlier to northern sails in the last months. Sailors claimed the dragon had scared the worst winds into other men's maps. The voyage was short in tells and long in hours. Jon stood at the bow when the Titan's shadow fell over them, and it felt like walking under an old rumor-made stone. Tycho Nestoris met him before the doors had finished deciding whether to open. The banker's face showed more lines than a year had a right to draw. He looked like a man who had been counting while walking uphill with a weight on one shoulder. He took Jon not to the small candlelit room but to a long gallery where the floor had been crafted with inlaid wood in tides and currents. Jon stood on the current that represented the Cohoric trade and felt odd respect for men who had chosen to step on what they must learn to respect. They think me a ledger with opinions, Tycho said without preamble. Sometimes I am. Sometimes that makes me better than most men with opinions, because I am at least honest about where mine come from. Sit. The matter unrolled as it had been hinted. A set of partners with respectable names and disreputable appetites had written their own equity into the bank's promises. They had hidden wagers inside properly notarized letters so that the bank would be paid either way, by truce and peace, or by war and interest. If truce continued, they would profit. If war returned, they would profit more. Men who believe this way will always conclude the more profitable outcome is inevitable, simply because they desire it. They had sought to make their desire contagious. What would you have me do? Tycho asked, though Jon thought he already knew. Take their profit from them, Jon said. Without cause, Tycho asked, and there was a gleam in his voice that was not amusement. With cause, Jon said. By cause. Make the cause sit at your table and speak its name. You ask me for theater, Tycho said. You invite me to humiliate men who can no longer afford to be taught humility. I invite you to weigh, Jon said. You very much enjoy weighing. It was a performance, and it shamed everyone present exactly as much as it should have. Tycho convened a gathering not in the counting room but in the great hall where certain pillars had been painted once and then left to peel, so they would remind men to repair what mattered. The partners arrived in the kind of silence that only coin can afford. The small clerk who liked the sound of the drawer was allowed to stand in a gallery. He flushed when he realized he had been seen and then paled when he thought what being seen might mean. Missandei had come and stood at Jon's left with a bundle of papers tied with a simple strip of cloth. Davos stood at Jon's right and kept his hands empty because sometimes that is what arguments need. Tycho spoke first, reminding the hall of the guarantee the bank had affixed to the truce. A guarantee that had bought coin less war, war less coin, until a balance had been established that most men had chosen to call peace because wars were not happening at the moment to remind them of other names. Then he read, in a voice without heat, the clauses of the private letters through which the partners had chosen to make the bank earn more by losing face. He did not rage. Numbers do not rage. He did not sigh. Sighs are for men who have run out of words. The partners tried to object. They spoke of prudence and of prudence's distant cousin, forethought. They said certain markets would require recalibration when sentimentalities had finished pretending to be policies. They said they were men of Bravos, and Bravos was a city that punished slavery, not profit. Tycho let them speak and then said, "You have enslaved our reputation," in a tone that made the sentence sound like a line cut into marble. Missandei untied her bundle. She had written to each of the 3 consortiums who had accepted the partners' private appetites as public good. She had asked them questions they had not expected anyone to ask with interest. She had asked for names of ships and dates of sailings and the price of oak in the shipyards last autumn and the going wage for a stevedore on the 4th quay at dusk. She had asked questions with numbers inside them, and she had done it in a dozen languages, including the one men use when they pretend to say yes and mean something else. The papers were answers. They were also confessions. When she read them aloud, They sounded like men realizing they had claimed to be paid twice for the same cart. Redemption, Tycho said at last to the partners. It is odd how seldom we are asked to calculate it. Today, you will calculate it and then perform it. He found them not in coin, which they could hide and replenish, but in time. They were not permitted to levy or collect interest for a year and a day. Their clerks were assigned to other men's rooms. They were required to summarize, in letters signed with their own names, the nature of the error they had made and why it had seemed reasonable to them, and to send these letters to every city that had signed the truce. The bank returned the fees it had collected on the consortium's behalf. Tycho had already ordered the cages of coin lifted and shifted. It was theater, yes, but theater that used weights and measures, and so the audience, being men who had learned to breathe in the smell of warmer brass, could not complain that it was only words. Afterward, in the smaller room with the beeswax candles and the map that no longer looked like a bruise, Tycho sat without wine and said, "My city is a city of knives hidden inside pens. Today we asked it to admit it had enjoyed watching itself bleed. It will enjoy telling itself that it has stopped," John said. "That is also useful." "You don't love us," Tycho said, without rancor. "I don't love anyone as a city," John said. "I love men. Sometimes. That is a dangerous preference," Tycho said, and smiled with both cruelty and affection. The letters went out. Men in Lorith who had never imagined themselves worth an explanation received one and laughed unkindly, and then took more care with their own phrasing. In Tyrosh, a woman with dyed hair he color of old grape skins read the letter aloud to a hall full of weavers who nodded like men who have been told what they already knew. She sent coin to bravos earmarked for widows whose husbands had drowned while performing what the partners had called calibration. In Volantis, Eva read and did not clap. She told her acolytes that sin confessed under pressure is not virtue, but it is geometry, and geometry often accomplishes what humility won't. The truce breathed again, not easier, but deeper. In the stepstones, 2 of the captains lost their nerve and turned to guarding instead of taxing. The third died not by dragon or decree, but by a rope gone slack at an inopportune moment. Men said the sea had a sense of humor. The sea heard them and remained unamused. John returned to Winterfell knowing in the way you know the path from bed to door in the dark that nothing he had made would become a law. It would remain an arrangement between men and the part of themselves they liked when they were not watched. Perhaps that was all anything deserved to be. He did not see Drogon again for a long time. The letter spoke of the dragon. Seen above the cedar isles at dusk, gliding over the sorrows where the fog refuses to save men from themselves. Circling the hills above Norvos once on a morning when a bell rang earlier than its memory recalled. Sometimes the reports sounded like warning. Sometimes like blessing. Often they sounded like weather. When the dragon came to the north at last, it was not as a herald or an enforcer. He came as a shadow across a midday sky in which the light had settled itself as if for a long afternoon. Men in the yard looked up and made the gestures men make no matter what gods have taught them to their parents. Drogon did not descend. He crossed the castle walls as if he were checking the arithmetic of stones, a teacher glancing over a pupil's shoulder to see if they had carried the one. Ghost barked once, not in terror, not in anger, but in that branch of acknowledgement wolves reserved for predators that are not their concern. The dragon passed, and the day resumed the business of being itself. Sansa watched the sky a while longer, and then returned to her table and her ink. Arya squinted and said something under her breath about a shadow deciding whether to be kind. Men came and went with their small worlds strapped to their backs. A girl from Barrow Tun broke a colt in the yard in 10 days while the stablemaster muttered that impatience ruins horses. She smiled, patient with his muttering. A woman from the Rills married a man from the Dreadfort, and both sets of cousins came with tension bottled up as gifts. They went home with enough bread to fill the awkward silences. A boy got lost in the crypts and returned with a splintered candle and an expression of such concentrated disappointment at the dead for not being more romantic that Jon laughed with an unseemly sound that made Sansa turn her head to hide her own smile. Jon tended to the small weather as he had to the large. He wrote when writing mattered and shut up when listening made the afternoon shorter. He took counsel from people who had learned to distrust men who enjoyed speaking. He learned to say no in a way that did not feel like an insult and yes in a way that did not feel like a bargain. Spring crept in without asking for introductions. The snow turned to slush that turned to mud that turned to something like soil. The first green blades appeared where everyone had bet, and then in a place no one had thought to irrigate. The castle smelled not of smoke alone now, but of wet earth and wool drying on lines and of the optimism of onions. Ravens brought fewer letters that felt like openings to larger rooms and more that felt like doors closing gently after having admitted something worth keeping. The free cities kept grudges, kept accounts, kept to the arrangement with the irregular fidelity that is all any structure can demand when porous men hold it up. There were violations. There were corrections. There were larger children growing bored by the words their parents used when speaking of tariffs. It was as much peace as anyone ever has the right to expect. One evening, under a sky so clear the stars looked like holes poked in a giant's curtain, John found Arya on the wall walk with her elbows on the parapet and her face at ease in a way it only ever was when it thought no one was watching it. She did not turn when he joined her, and for a while they watched the dark learn to be less afraid of itself. "The Iron Bank sent a gift," she said at last. "A box. You'll hate it. It contains a bell." "What does it mean?" John asked. "It means they want to be remembered for what they haven't yet done wrong," she said, smiling. "It's not a bad reason to send bells." John said, "Let it ring. You'll wake the gods would," she said. "They never sleep," he said. And the bell rang, low, a note that made the stone beneath their feet confess it had known that sound in another place. The wind carried the tone through the yard and into the chambers where men snored or whispered, and through the kitchens where a girl burned her hand and scolded the pot, and through the stables where a horse tossed its head, not annoyed but approving. Out beyond the walls, across fields that had learned to keep hold of what rain gave them, the sound went on until it became indistinguishable from the night. John looked up, expecting nothing, receiving only the honest expanse of darkness punctured by stars that had watched dragons and children and treaties and betrayals and found all of them equally worth observing. He thought of Qohor's red leaves, of the smell of hot iron and hot scales, of Tycho's careful anger, of Missandei's questions that made men answer themselves. He thought of Sansa's hand on the table's edge, steadying even the wood with her insistence. He thought of Davos's humming. He thought of the sea, writing and rewriting FO, forgiving and erasing without meaning either. He did not make a speech. He had learned to let the world be sometimes. The bell fell silent. The night resumed. Somewhere, a wolf sang the first note of a song the hills already knew how to sing back. A season later, a boy with hair like straw and a step too quick to be trusted came from the east bearing a scrap of news dressed like news but built like a promise. In Volantis, a group of merchants had built a public granary on a dare, on a calculation. That bread offered in hard times at a price already agreed would buy more calm than the profit earned by famine. They had named the building the balance. Eva had refused to bless it. She had said it did not need a god when mathematics would serve. The boy told the story with the breathless fidelity of someone who had watched a line of hungry men hold their tempers because they could count. John gave him stew and listened twice. Years layered themselves with more grace than skill. The truce did not become a song sung by men around fires. It became something men counted on when they forgot to count everything else. It was broken often enough to remain alert. It was defended often enough to remain loved by those who had learned to love dullness, which is to say women who had had enough of burying husbands and men who had discovered that raising their children cost less than revenge. Drogon's sightings grew rarer. When men did see him, they held the news in their mouths like a sweet they weren't ready to chew. They told it to one person only or to no one, not out of fear but from an instinct older than rumor. The knowledge that some facts are more useful when kept close to the chest, like warmth in early spring. Once, in a winter that had forgotten to die, John stood in the yard as a shadow crossed the wall, and he did not look up. He did not need to. He felt the weight of that gossip and was satisfied. In the end, the North did what the North has always done. It endured. And Essos did what Essos has always done. It calculated. Somewhere in the space between endurance and calculation, a man who had died and returned, who had told a beast to be a scale, who had asked a bank to forgive itself the easiest profits and seek a harder balance, found that he could be a person rather than a symbol for more days than not. He ate, he slept, he made small mistakes and corrected them without humiliation. He stood in rooms where men argued, and he did not try to be bigger than the room. He held a door, not forever, not always, not perfectly. He held it long enough for other hands to join his. On a spring afternoon, when the light did that generous thing where it stays a little longer than short charts might allow, a child ran across the yard with a stick like a sword, shouting to another child that he was the dragon and she the bank and the third the sea. They collided and tumbled and stood up laughing and traded parts. An old man on the bench beneath the broken-toothed crenellation watched them with a look he thought was invisible. John, passing, caught his eye, and both looked away politely, men sharing a secret, that sometimes the world learns to play at the better story. That night, as the kitchen's last flame was tamped and the gods would breathe like a creature content with its own roots, John dreamed again not of crowns or gods or treaties or even walls. He dreamed of a scale, simple, wooden, a farmer's tool, balanced, not because the weights were perfect, but because a hand rested lightly, thoughtfully, upon one side, testing, trusting, ready to lift if needed, ready to let go when the balance held on its own. He woke without remembering the dream, as it should be. He rose, pulled on his cloak, and went to see whether the dawn had learned anything new while they all slept. It hadn't. It did not need to. Across the sea, bells rang in Norvos without anyone congratulating them. In Mir, a dye master sighed at a new blue that refused to reveal its proper name and decided he loved it for that. In Tyrosh, a girl with stained hands counted out coin and then put 2 back in the jar because she felt like it. In Pentos, a man wrote a letter to a rival and paused halfway through to compliment him on a well-built hull, and then scratched out the compliment and then wrote it again, letting it stand. In Bravos, a clerk shut his drawer carefully, savoring the sound, and then went home with a loaf that smelled like an argument won without a voice raised. In Kohor, the forest did not move, and yet the wind carried with it a scent that might have been iron, might have been memory, might have been a red leaf's opinion. And in the deep sky where maps are jokes, a long black shape took the measure of a cloud and decided to pass through rather than around. The world did not notice. It did not need to. It had been taught to count without always needing to see the scale.